Thank you, Richard, and thank you for reciting some of those nice awards I've received and accolades through the years. They've been certainly far more than I ever deserved, but I don't think I've thought and been surprised any more than I was yesterday in being able to join Bob and in the Sandbox Hall of Leaders. So I want to thank you, Carl, and the whole team at Shepard for that recognition yesterday. I also want to thank you for the program. I'm going to mention two things. First one was Harris Rosen. I didn't know, I've met Mr. Rosen twice before. I did not know his story until yesterday, Carl. And first, I applaud the way you handled that whole session. What a great moderator. And second, what a great individual he is. The CEIR Predict Conference is held annually in New York. It's September the 12th, and it's at the Waldorf Astoria. And I'm going to be at that elevator he was talking about. I have no real hope of seeing Marilyn Monroe, but hopefully there are a lot of other people there. Also, I wanted to mention to you that the Rosen Group and the Peabody Hotel both have made commitments this year to the two CEIR golf tournaments. One is Friday in Chicago at the Hinsdale Golf Club, and the other one is at the International Country Club in Fairfax, Virginia on the 9th of September. They're looking for people that would like to play. So if you're from Chicago or the DC area and that you would like to play, if you could let me know, let the Shepard folks know, and we'll pass those along to the folks at Rosen and the folks at the Peabody. It's on a Monday the 26th of August. Next Monday. That's next Monday. The other one, part of the program, I had to thank you for, and she's gone. Michelle's not here now, is she? Okay. Michelle yesterday on the social media, did any of you dream hashtag last night? I did. And I must confess, I think if there are Martians up there observing us and what we're doing, I hope they have access to Google so they can figure out what the hell hashtag means and what it is. But when I awakened this morning, I flipped on the TV and get the latest news, and the first thing that came up was a Honda commercial. Now, have any of you seen the Honda commercials based on hashtag messages? There are a couple of them in terms of they're presumably reading comments from customers or people that have posted that don't like their cars, basically, and then telling them if they'll come into the Honda dealership, they'll get a car they'll like. The lady this morning, which, by the way, I tried over there, and you can do it. You can Google Honda TV commercials, and you can see this commercial on there. And she starts off and she's talking about her hashtag is hashtag stupid car. So with this, she goes through her pitch about Honda and she gets in one and she's turning on the radio and playing some kind of goofy music. And then all of a sudden she goes, hashtag yo! And everyone's excited about all of that. That is no way to wake up in the morning. So I think as we go through our application of social media, we still have a lot to learn. Now, Richard mentioned that I have announced and working with the CEIR board, they started the search for my replacement. Anyone interested, search-wide, Mike Gamble and his team are handling the search. And I do plan to leave the end of the year. People ask me, how do you know when it's time to leave? And that's probably a question most of you another 20, 30 years will have to face yourselves in terms of how you make that decision. For me, there was a seminal moment that actually guided my thinking, and maybe I was lucky in that respect. It happened on a Saturday. I was out in the car running some errands, had my list taken off one at a time. My phone rang, it was my wife. And she asked me to stop by Walmart on the way home and pick something up. So I said, okay. Finished my errands, drove to Walmart, parked, got out, walked in the front door, and I just stood there. And I just stood there. And I didn't have a clue what the hell I was supposed to get at Walmart. So while I'm standing there looking bewildered, I'm sure, this little old guy comes up with a Walmart shirt, greeter guy. He comes up and says, "Good morning, could I help you?" So I said, "Well, my wife asked me to stop and get something. I can't remember what it is. I left my cell phone in my car." He said, "Not a problem, follow me." With this, he starts off walking, and for some obscure reason, I followed him. As I'm following him, I'm thinking, why am I following this guy? How could he possibly know what my wife wants me to get at Walmart? And I realized then we weren't going back into the area where all the product is. We were headed over to a counter. So then I figured out he must be going to take me over to a phone, since he knows I don't have my cell phone. We get over this counter. There's a little lady sitting back at a desk 20 feet or so back. And as we approach the counter, he yells, "It's Mildred, Mildred, this guy needs an application to be a greeter." Now, just to be clear, I made that up. That didn't really happen that way. Okay, this morning we want to take a few minutes and we're going to take a look at the industry from the standpoint of where we are today, where we came from, very quick review. I always like to get everyone on the same page, where we are today, and then finish in the end with some look at where are we going. Now, Shepard has this PowerPoint, so you don't need to take a lot of notes because you can have it. And as you can have it, you'll pick up the slides and the data that you're going to see in some of these slides. I always like to start with the U.S. history to get us on a common base because a lot of disagreement about when the industry as we know it really did get started. As far as the U.S. is concerned, there were two events that took place in the late 50s, early 60s. It was the completion of the interstate highway system and the commercial introduction of the jet airplane. Prior to that time, the idea of traveling halfway across the country for a 2 or 3 day meeting made absolutely no sense. And by the way, that's why your Smurf groups, your religious fraternal, educational groups, that's why they all meet in the summer. They all met in the summer because you packed the wife and kids in the car and you took a week to drive across the country to go to the Southern Baptist Convention or the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church or whatever it might be, or the Lions or whatever. So the jet airplane interstate highway system changed things. The first building that was built opened in 1959. It was the rotunda and some 90,000 square feet of exhibit space in Las Vegas. Now, don't go to Las Vegas and look for the rotunda because the rotunda is no longer there, but the 90,000 square feet of space behind it still is part of South Hall. The first major building opened the following year, and that was McCormick Place in Chicago. And it was our first very large facility. Some of you know it burned down in '67, and it reopened in 1971. The real expansion took place in the '70s, and it's taken place every year since then. So our industry, as we benchmark it, nominally we're a little over 40 years old in our current configuration that we practice today in exhibition centers. CEIR census was done in 2000. We determined that we thought it was important if we were going to be an industry and describe ourselves as an industry, that at least we ought to know how many shows are produced a year. Most of us were using numbers from then Trade Show Week, 4,000 or 5,000 shows a year, and we generally thought that was a fairly reliable number. Much to our surprise, the CEIR census in 2000 revealed more than 14,000 events being held in the U.S. and Canada. Of that, some 10,000 in the U.S. are B2B events, 10,000 business-to-business events. By the way, we spent 2 years defining an exhibition. You know how our industry associations are. Getting all of them together to agree on one definition of what is an exhibition was much more difficult than we originally thought. And we determined that a definition is 10 or more exhibiting companies and 3,000 or more net square feet of exhibit space. We wanted to separate ourselves from one company shows and road shows and other types of events that could have been under our definition. The industry actually existed. Our first record of a show in the U.S. is in the 1890s, the Photography Association. We were holding shows long before the 60s and 70s. And those events were being held in hotels. How many of you ever been in the 7th floor of the Palmer House Hotel and seen the showrooms? Remember the old showrooms up there? Okay, here's what happened. A traveling salesman would make a schedule to come to Chicago or any other town, call the major hotel, and rent a showroom for a specified period of time. He'd then load everything in his station wagon. He'd drive to the city. He'd get to the hotel, and the bellman would take out all of his samples and the things that he was going to have for his showroom and get them up to the room. He'd then call catering, and he needed banquet. He wanted a little food and beverage, some cookies and donuts. He wanted catering. He needed some tables, a couple of chairs, some things in the facility. He needed power, electrical power, so he called engineering, and engineering arranged the electrical power for him. And of course, he had housekeeping come in and clean every night. And the ambience in the hotel, just as it is here, is in place, isn't it? The carpet, the permanent signage, all of the things that we use to find our way around are here. Then we built great big boxes made out of concrete with concrete floors that had none of these features. So what happened? Well, the showroom became an empty concrete hall. We had to have material handling. Someone had to figure out how to get the goods out of those station wagons, or trucks as it later turned out, into the exhibit space. And who was going to do that? We didn't have a bellman. We needed food service. We needed furniture rental. We needed utility services for our exhibits. And we needed cleaning. And what happened? For the most part, the facilities determined anything that invaded their building systems they wanted to control. Most of you aren't old enough to remember old PBX switchboards, but we used to have PBX switchboards, and we'd have 1,000 phones out on the trade show floor to the exhibiting companies. We had, if you look at water, waste, natural gas, if you ran a convention center, would you let an outside contractor come in there and tap into your natural gas system or your water or waste system? Of course not. So they wanted to control those services. At that point in time, services like electrical could blow out the entire building because the buildings weren't zoned like they're zoned today. So what we saw was the buildings reserving what they wanted to do and then determining you're on your own to find a resource to do these other things. We don't want to make signs. We don't want to own carpet. We don't want to own furniture. We don't want to do these things. Cleaning generally went with whether or not they had another building. So if you're running the Astor Hall and you've got the Astrodome, or how about the Georgia World Congress Center and the Dome, you're already cleaning a building. So extending the cleaning over to the convention center makes sense. Standalone building, it doesn't. And that's why we see variables in our industry today of what practices exist in some cities and some don't. So that's just a little bit of background for you on how we got here. Oh yeah, and all that ambiance is temporary. And that's what allowed companies like Shepard and some of their colleagues like Freeman and GES and Hargrove to Fern to get into business. But at that time, they were Andrews, Bartlett, and Breedy, and a whole bunch of different operators, Mancraft. And that industry, as you know, has consolidated significantly over time. But they were the ones that enable us to take that empty shell of a convention center and turn it into a sparkling jewel that today mimics the furnishings you have in hotels. That's where we came from. So we did the first census in 2000. We repeated it in 2010. Scared to death. We knew that 01 and 02 had happened. We knew that 08 and 9 and even into 10 had happened. And we had great rumors that our industry was a shrinking industry. That was a headline in the New York Times. It took me 3 years of dealing with their editors to get them to undo that headline because there was no evidence that we were truly a shrinking industry. And even if we did lose some events, when you're dealing with 14,000 events, what happens if you lose 100? Statistically, it's insignificant in terms of what we were doing. We were most pleased to find the drop wasn't nearly as precipitous as we thought it might be. Since everyone kept calling it a North American census, we decided we probably ought to add Mexico and really make it a North American census. You know, we Americans aren't too specific about geography and things like that. So we added Mexico, and they came up with 722 events. Those events are all held in convention centers. So we believe that's an understatement of what's really there. Total US, Mexico, and Canada was 14,541, not a number dissimilar from the number in 2000. That is more than 50% of all of the exhibitions held around the world in any given year. We have gone from being the baby of the industry and the follower to the leader. And that is why so many of the practices that you're adopting are so critically important to the global exhibition industry, because it's being invented here in terms of what you're doing. So more than half of the exhibitions held around the world are held in North America. The average size of the United States was 48,000 net square feet. By the way, PCMA did a study of their membership, which, as you know, is predominantly healthcare shows, and their number came out almost exactly on top of our overall industry number. This is just a quick little rundown for you on B2B versus B2C. Only 37% of the events are held in convention centers in 2010. That was a drop from about 44% in the year 2000. And what that says to us is we experienced some shrinkage. The organizers went back into that friendly environment. We called hotels the incubator because, as you all know, they're a lot less expensive to operate in. You don't have to worry about that signage. You don't worry about that carpet. You don't need to worry about shuttle bus transportation. So the hotel environment is our incubator, allowing us to take events and grow them to a point where they're big enough and strong enough that we can afford to take them into those convention centers. 67% are owned by associations. 67% are owned by associations. What that tells us is that we're a cottage industry. We're a cottage industry. Someone mentioned a little earlier today about their association being a cottage industry. What are some other cottage industries you can think of? Well, think about beauty shops and barber shops and other discretionary consumer goods and services. We're a cottage industry because our largest single organizer has less than 4% of the market. Less than 4% of the market, and that's Reed. So since there is no industry leader, there's very little industry fellowship in terms of what's there. And since there's no 5,000-pound gorilla on the organizer side, we all look to suppliers for money, don't we? Whenever we're having a campaign, for capital campaign, ASE, PCMA, CEIR, where do we go? Because the hotels, the destinations, the general service contractors, they're the ones with the money. And that's why we go there. We don't have an industry today like we have in the rest of the world, where we have major media companies that own the larger portion of all of the shows, or in the case of Germany, France, and Italy, the facilities that actually own those shows. 32% then are owned by media companies and entrepreneurs, and as we know, the entrepreneurs are missing today. How are we doing? Well, the CEIR index report is our Dow Jones. When we created the census was a snapshot. And all the reports we did after that, even with the CEIR index report, were a report of what happened in the previous year. But the index report gave us a history not only of the industry as a whole, but by breaking the industry down into 14 different business sectors. You see, in the last 25 years of the last century, all industries were growing. And we really didn't care who was growing the fastest, because all of our shows were taking off as they kept adding new facilities, and we kept expanding our businesses. So we come along now and say, what we really want to be able to do is talk intelligently with people and provide tools for you, the organizer, to see how you're doing versus the overall industry, how you're doing versus your peer group. And here's the way it's represented graphically. This graph takes us back, and it'll show you that this base year is 2009. The original base year was 2000. We recalibrated and reset it to 2009 when we added a predictive feature in 2010. As you can see, we track 4 metrics: net square feet of exhibit space, number of exhibiting companies, professional attendance, and revenue. That's revenue to the organizer. Revenue to the organizer. And you can see those lines and track for yourself and see where the industry is today. And what from that is any really good news? Because obviously we can see what happened to us in 2008 and 9, what an incredible drop that was. And yet now we're beginning to see the indication that the industry is about to resume growth. And in 14 and 50, our economists are saying, hopefully in a much more aggressive vein than what we've experienced in the last few years. The line to keep your eye on is the green one. The green one. We all know our leading indicator is what? Attendance. Attendance. We have good attendance, we have good buyers, we ought to be able to sell exhibit space. If we're not selling exhibit space, we probably need different staff. That's the simple model in terms of what's there. We put buyers and sellers together. That's what we do. To give you some idea of our industry is a trailing indicator. We are not a leading indicator. We trail. Here it gives you a graphic presentation of our industry versus GDP here in the United States. And as you can see, we had an anomaly in 2010 when we actually outperformed GDP. That was back when everyone thought the economy was going to recover at a much more robust rate than it actually has to this point. And our industry took off and got ahead of the curve. But we want to continue to trail GDP. Our goal is we'd like GDP to be 5, 6, 7%, not 1, 2%, if we're going to trail it in terms of what's happening in our own industry. Here's another little slide that our economists found that you might find interesting is the parallel between industry performance and non-farm payroll employment. These guys are always out here looking at different indices and metrics and stuff, and how in the hell they found this one, I have no idea. But as I told you, the industry sectors perform differently. We have two sectors that tend to be leading indicators for our industry. The first one is the building construction sector. That's what you're looking at there. The building construction sector has led the United States out of every recession since 1914. Every recession, building construction has led us out. Jerry Howard, the CEO of National Association of Home Builders, told us at our Predict conference 2 years ago, don't wait for us this time because we're 3 years away. Home starts are up, 800,000, could hit 1 million this year. That sounds great, doesn't it? Not when your target of sustainability is 1.5 to 1.8 million new residential starts a year. Gives you some idea how far behind that industry is. And by the way, think what happens to your show if you lost 60% of your exhibit space and 40% of your attendance, because that's what happened to home builders. That's what happened to home builders. So we watch the building and construction sector very, very carefully, just like other industries do. The second one we watch closely is the consumer goods section. This sector really is always, this slide has always been one I've regretted. If we had been paying attention to the consumer goods sector in 2007, notice that slide in 2007, track that back, we would have seen that industry sector go into decline. If that had been recognized for what it was, I think we would have had a much more different outlook for 2008. We could see trouble ahead because the retailers saw it. Consumer goods are finished goods shows. Someone was talking about, the archery fellow was talking about being a sales show. Consumer goods are finished goods shows. Retailers come and place orders for future delivery, housewares, hardware, apparel, jewelry, those kinds of events. If retailers don't have confidence, they cut back. And that's what happened in 2007. They saw it coming. And as a result, those shows went into decline. So we now are watching those shows a lot more carefully than we were in 2007. And as you can see, the outlook for them is much rosier. In case you think everyone had a bad decade, there is one sector that actually grew all through the decade. Anyone guess what that stands for? GV? Government. Government. Now we all know when government's outspending the private sector, we got a problem. And that's exactly what happened during the decade of the 2000s. As you can see, continuous growth. And don't forget, the government federal government is the largest buyer of every consumer business-to-business product. The largest. In some cases, we can't even see who's number 2. So when the federal government stops spending, it's going to impact trade shows and it's going to impact businesses. And we're seeing that a little bit extent right now. Overall, the index for the industry, this is a quarter-over-quarter look. I want you to first take a look at what happened in last year, and then take a look at where we are this year. So what you can see is we started January full of optimism and good performance in our shows, and then with each succeeding quarter, it trailed off. Now let's take your eyes over to 2013 Q1, and once again, we were at 1.3, now we're at 1.2. The Economist, our forecast for the year was actually 1.1% growth for the industry in 2013. We're going to likely experience that. So we're seeing happen in the economy is we begin every year with this excitement and this enthusiasm that this year is going to be better. And by the second quarter, we're disillusioned. And we're beginning to pull back and say, this isn't going to be better. The solution, everyone move your show into the first quarter. Okay, CEIR research. Richard is right. The basis of the CEIR research is to provide tools for you, the organizers, for the industry as a whole, on the industry itself. About 80% of it is geared toward exhibiting companies. And since exhibiting companies are horses we can lead to the trough but not make them drink, we rely on show organizers and contractors to distribute some of this information to them on best practices. I think all of us could tell stories all day long about exhibiting companies that don't have good practices and manning their exhibits and following up on their leads. I love that FU, but all I could think of was the Odd Couple was Felix Unger. I don't know if you remember that one or not. But that's exactly what we see coming out. So if you look at the array of CEIR research that's free, we'll find that there's all kinds of opportunities to educate your exhibitors and help them be more successful in your shows. We actually are just releasing the digital playbook, which will follow exactly some of the things Michelle talked about in the terms of the use of social media and other digital techniques in order to improve your overall show performance. Here's gives you some idea of the releases, broken down into 3 different categories. By the way, the Guru Reports is a series we started several years ago. These are digests and very short reports written by industry experts on some of the more mystical things we do, like material handling, like electrical, like trying to give the exhibiting company a much better understanding of how this works and why it's that way. But in about a 10 to 15 minute read for the most part. We know that's probably their attention span. So that digital playbook, that last one, is insight for you relating to exhibitor and organizer practices and what you're doing. Clearly, that's a work in progress that's going to keep growing because we're seeing new applications coming every day. Still to come, we've got a whole series of programs in the pipeline. Nancy Drapo is our Director of Research, and she's working with our committees in terms of basic needs and prioritizing these research reports in terms of which are the most critical and in the highest demand. The CEIR model today is to deliver what you need, not what we're able to produce. You understand that? For years, we were guilty, and I think we as show organizers sometimes are guilty of developing content based on what someone's willing to do. So someone's willing to speak at our meeting, so we say, great. Now the fact that they're talking about something no one at our meeting gives a damn about is irrelevant. We filled a program slot. Well, we can be guilty of doing the same thing when someone's willing to write a report or do a research project. Our strategy is the other way around. Do your market research on what the industry needs and then try to produce it for them. Unfortunately, sometimes you may not still want to drink that water, but at least it's out there for you. We know, and our leadership is dealing today with a series of questions that I suspect all of you are dealing with that to some way is going to dictate our strength going forward. For one thing, can we return to pre-2000 levels? Major question in terms of whether or not the shows themselves can, predominantly because a number of our larger exhibiting companies have reduced down into smaller spaces. And as they've done so, they've gotten to become effective in those spaces and make things work. So they're not quite as eager to go back. If they're in a 20 by 20 and they're doing great, why in the world do they want to go back to that 50 by 50 in terms of what's there? So I was interested in your session you just finished in terms of raising the bar on revenues. One of the ways on revenues is obviously to try to get them to go back where they used to be. Reality is we don't see that happening. We don't see that happening. I'll put another context. Everybody remember when we were doing all custom built exhibits? How about those double deckers, huh? Built out of wood, huh? Weren't those great? Took about 5 days to build and paint right there in the exhibit hall. They were fabulous. How many of them you see today? Why? Because that's not an efficient way to exhibit anymore today. And that style's gone away. And you know what? It took the exhibit designers and producers years to accept that because they didn't want it to go away. And for them to get in the rental business, which of course the general service contractors got into right out of the box. So as we watch these changes, then it's up to us as the organizers to adapt to that change and not spend a lot of time and energy trying to get an exhibiting company to go back into what may have been a wise thing for them to do in the first place. May not have been a wise use of their money. Second area that's a real concern, should be a real concern to all of us, is the dilemma the cities are facing today in terms of revenues. Some of the stories that you've read about are indeed serious, serious issues for elected officials, for the electorate, for the people that live in those cities. Phoenix has closed 11 libraries, 8 senior citizen centers, that's hard to say. Fort Worth didn't open 7 swimming pools last year. The reality for them is they're desperate for revenue because as the property values fell, so did the tax base that went along with them, so did the sales tax revenues from the overall downturn in the industry. Given that, can they continue to write checks to subsidize convention center operations? And if they can't, what's going to happen to those buildings? We all know what's going to happen to them. They're going to deteriorate. If you don't fix it, it gets worse, right? And you've all done tours, I'm sure, of centers that unlike what Mr. Rosen talked about yesterday, walking in and seeing a torn carpet or a dirty this or a dirty that, who hadn't walked into a convention center and seen that? Seen light bulbs that don't work in convention centers that aren't being replaced because they don't have the budget dollars. Part of that challenge is going to come from organizers who need to be more fair in their dealings with centers in terms of what you're going to pay to use them. Because we have to help. If we want state-of-the-art facilities and quality facilities, we've got to do our part in terms of the revenue generation for those buildings. The idea of giving it away and keeping it state-of-the-art just doesn't mix in terms of what they're able to do. We're watching these cities very carefully. And then, of course, the ones that, when will they know? When will they know they can no longer compete? I can already tell you of about 4 that have stopped competing for the national business. They won't come out and say that because they'll still take a piece of national business if it comes along. They're just not out here chasing it anymore. Why? Because they know they can't compete. Their building doesn't. Nashville, eye-popping technology. Phoenix, when it opened, the same thing. And with every new building that opens, with the latest and sexiest technology and cool treatment, puts every other building at a disadvantage because you're going to those and say, why don't you guys have that? Flat screens were probably the latest trend that spread across the industry. We're going to watch this one very carefully. But to wrap up, let me just talk a minute about the future, in terms of what the future looks like. First, I want to do it from 4 points of view. And these are the points of view, obviously, of the backbone of our industry. Let's start with the organizers. Start with you. What are things like today? Well, we already told you 67% are owned by association. For the most part, you sell real estate. Why do you sell real estate? Because you can. Because you can. People always ask me, why don't you do relationship selling for exhibit space? Because you don't need to. You need to sell advertising. You don't need to sell exhibit space. You put out a brochure, and a guy calls you or sends you back something and says, I want to exhibit, and I want space 617, and you send him a contract, and he signs it and sends it back and sends you a check. And then about 6 weeks before the show, you send him this big book telling him all the things he can't do after he gets there. That's our relationship with exhibiting companies. We sell real estate. It's a seller-customer relationship, isn't it? Seller-customer relationship. We recognize their customers till we start moving. Now, we got your money, and we're going to hold your freight at the door until you shape up, buddy. The reality for us is we spend more time managing the show floor than we do marketing the show to begin with. And that's a trend within IAEE and the other industry associations. They've got to change in terms of teaching exhibit managers sales and marketing, and not just focus on the 1 week of move-in. The entrepreneurs are missing. That only makes sense, doesn't it? Why would you launch a new show in a down economy? Wouldn't make any sense to do that. So they're missing today. So what's tomorrow look like? Well, we're beginning to see some shifts. Several associations have already sold their shows to strategic exhibition organizing companies, or partnering with them in some way, or are considering doing that. Why? Because several of you have found out you're in a risk business. And for the last 25 years, the last century, you weren't. 01, 02 came along, industry lost 5%. You thought that was an anomaly. We were back, by 04, we're back to pre-2000 levels. 08 to 10 comes along, we lost 15%. 15%. And we're still not back. So the reality for associations relying on non-dues revenue is that they're beginning to wonder, is this time that I take this asset and convert it and get out of the risk business? Relationship selling is got to come. Understanding why companies are exhibiting, what they're trying to achieve, how you can help them achieve those goals has got to become a theme of the overall marketing effort, because the exhibiting companies are going to require it. You know who's doing that today? General service contractors. General service contractors have figured out the exhibiting companies are customers too. And they're getting in their heads and trying to figure out, what are you trying to achieve? What can we do to help you? What can we do with experiential marketing to let you have a bigger show? Organizers are going to have to do the same thing. That means additional investment in staff and capability within these staffs. The seller-customer relationship will become a partnership relationship. The more you do to help a company achieve their objectives, the more you're getting in bed with them. And the reality for you is, we're going to partner and help you do this. We're going to go with you all the way. We're going to help you absolutely evaluate what happened at our show so that we can get a better experience next year in terms of what we might even do differently. Entrepreneurs are the key to growth. They'll be back when the economy's back. Don't think all the good ideas have been taken. That's not true. There are a lot of creative people out there. How about the events themselves? Well, here was our attitude: growth's unlimited. Bigger is better. We got an average show size, we said, of 48,000 square feet. Well, is that really true? We think growth's really unlikely. Growth's unlikely. In the year 2008, there were 38 shows over 500,000 net square feet. 8 of those were over $1 million. 8 of those were over $1 million. In 2012, there were 20. 3 of them over $1 million. 3 over $1 million. The idea that the mega show is the direction of our industry that some destinations bought into like the one we're sitting in. Thinking every these shows were going to be 1 million net square feet of exhibit space, reality check tells us that hadn't happened. That hadn't happened. And you know what? Whoop. Truth is, it probably isn't going to, because cozier is more comfortable. So what are you seeing? You're seeing fracturing of those big mega shows and horizontal shows into vertical columns in terms of what's there. In your own lifetimes, think about it. The sporting goods industry used to have 2 big sporting goods shows, didn't it? NSGA, and then along came the Super Show. Hardy Cats, anybody remember Hardy Cats and the Super Show? Owned by the manufacturers. NSGA was owned by the retailers. Where's the Super Show today? It's gone. There is no horizontal show in the sporting goods industry. Why? Because they went into vertical niches. They'd rather go to a golf show or a ski show or an outdoor recreation show. If I'm Wilson and I make all these products, I'd like to go to a show that I know what to take and who to send. Healthcare industry did this 25, 35 years ago. American Medical Association, American Hospital Association, American Nurses Association, 3 largest healthcare organizations. Which one has the largest exhibition? Trick question, none of them do. But there are 1,500 healthcare shows because they went into those vertical, cozier columns. That's certainly the trend we see happening today. That means probably the show size will remain largely unchanged in terms of what's there. Then there are our friends at the facilities. God love them. We deal with these people in such a mysterious way. But first, those first generation buildings we talk about, those boxes with docks that were built in the 60s and 70s, they're basically all gone. A couple of them continue to survive with some upgrades. The second generation buildings probably have plus or minus 5 years. Give you an idea of a second generation building, Javits opened in 1986. It was probably one of the last of the second generation buildings. So as Javits ages, we always know it was a second class building when it was built. The roof's always leaked and has a lot, it's 90% exhibit space to less than 10% meeting space. It was built on a different model. And so its day is probably going to come. By the way, the latest valuation on that land it sits on in what used to be Hell's Kitchen in New York, how about $4 billion? Convention center may not be best use, I don't know. But third generation buildings came along and they began to add some hotel finishes and some things, but they obviously, just as they got going, they absolutely got whacked by the fourth generation buildings that came in right behind them. And those fourth generation buildings kind of just overshadowed them in terms of what's there. What's the fourth generation building? Phoenix. Been to Phoenix? What's it doing? It's trying to incorporate the convention center into the community with kind of food service courts. The public comes in as well as the private groups that are in. It looks more like a hotel, doesn't it? All hotel finishes, all these sort of things. It's what you're going to see in Nashville. And that's the new model, not boxes with docks set out in the country somewhere, but rather a corporate facility for the community as a whole, built within the city center, where there is access to the public as well as to the private groups using those buildings. Those are the fourth generation buildings. And of course, with all the sexiest technology available on the day. So the fourth generation buildings are the ones that are going to put some of those second generation buildings out of business. Repurposing should be on everyone's agenda. Have you all heard about repurposing? Buildings that have done anything in repurposing? Buildings that, let me give you examples of full repurposing. Anybody remember the Rivergate Convention Center in New Orleans? What is it now? Casino. Rivergate Casino. The Albert Thomas Center in Houston. It's a full family entertainment center, restaurants, theaters, retail in terms of what's there. Those buildings were totally repurposed. Most of those buildings were torn down. Most of those buildings were just torn down and replaced with something else. Repurposing today, though, has taken on a new meaning. In their fight for revenue, convention centers have begun looking at leasing out pieces of their building on long-term leases. Reno has 5 halls. They leased out 1, 2, and 3 to a movie studio, 5-year lease. McCormick Place is looking at the lower level in North Hall for a 10-year lease to a server farm. Hall F in Atlanta has been outsourced. You're going to continue to see the buildings taking space out of service and leasing them to outside groups in order to generate more revenue. So watch that word repurposing that you're going to hear a lot about from the facilities going forward. By the way, they aren't going to talk a lot about that. They aren't going to talk a lot. Just like you don't hear them talking a lot about the number of buildings that are organizing their own shows, do you? You know how many buildings are organizing their own shows today? And how many shows some of them are up to? You don't have a clue, do you? Because they aren't broadcasting it in terms of what's there. But I can tell you those dark days, they're going to fill. And if they have to fill them by producing their own events, they will. And they can. And by the way, to some extent, they'll partner with an organizer to fill that date in terms of organizing the event for them as opposed to them getting in the event organizing business. Those are the trends going along with the facilities. Maintaining the status quo the way it is today, that's just not likely. That's not likely. So what are their choices? Well, they're going to make the best of a series of whole bad choices because they don't want to do any of them. That's why I say these are bad choices, because they don't want to do them. They want to keep doing what they're doing right now. But they can own their own events. They can become service contractors. There's a good idea, Carl. They can just go out here and buy some pipe and drape, forklift or two, and that's all it takes, isn't it? They can partner with organizers on some sort of a shared reward basis. I'll give you a free haul. You organize the event. If the event takes off, you give me a 5-year contract to keep it in my building, and now you start paying for the haul. That's not a bad deal. Or they can do all the above. And what we see happening today is everything except the service contractor side. I think they've looked at that one carefully and figured out there isn't any money in it. There just isn't any money in it. So the risk is too great. There's no money in it. They do this because they love the organizers and they love the business. It's a break-even proposition. They're nonprofit too. Or they can repurpose their building. The whole building or just a portion of the building. We've got to watch the facilities very carefully. I did a session with this meeting a few years ago, Richard. You may remember when I told him I got the call from Obama. And Obama called me this morning and he said, you got 3 players in your industry. You got organizers, you got facilities, and you got general service contractors. That's too many. That's too many mouths to feed. We got to get rid of somebody. Who are you going to get rid of? Of those 3 players, which one is essential? Facility. It's facilities. Facilities are the only one that's essential. They can organize events. They can become service contractors. So the reality for us today is the partnerships and what we do with those buildings and what those buildings do over time is absolutely critical to the future success of our industry. And then finally there are the general service contractors. They see the organizer as the primary customer. It's kind of a master-slave relationship that you guys have with these poor devils. We deal with cost shifting, famous term. Everyone just loves to let the exhibitors pay for all the free crap you get. The revenue centers are historic, except some of the history's kind of gone away. See, I'm so old, I remember when smokers and haul trees and wastebaskets were some of the things that they used to rent and get the most money for. I don't think you got any of those anymore, do you? The corporate knowledge of the event is greater than that of the organizer. The corporate knowledge of the event is greater than that of the organizer. And that's because of turnover. That's because of turnover. The continuity the general service contractors bring to our events is absolutely critical. And when you turn over and you get a new show manager in there, I don't care how good they are, they don't know that show. And they don't know the nuances of that show. The general service contractor does. So the continuity they provide over multiple year contracts can be extremely critical to the organization if indeed they deal with any level of turnover. And I've always said they actually run most of the show floors. In fact, my famous speech I made several years ago, I estimated that general service contractors run 75% of the shows. 75% of the shows, for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them pretty good. Some of you are too busy with other things that you really don't have time to be out there on the show floor. You got a board, you got author, you got all these people you're having to deal with. So the general service contractor is kind of left to make things work out there in that exhibit hall. Besides that, it's hot and sweaty out there, and you don't want to go out there. I used to say, sit in my office, sometimes I thought about going out on the show floor and see how things were going, but if I usually lay down, took a nap, thought would go away. Tomorrow, exhibitor's primary customer. Exhibitor's primary customer. See, by the show organizer, we gave them access to a market, and that access to that market used to be fairly exclusive. Today's model today, we're seeing lots of different things happen where pieces are being hived off by other general service contractors on a show where they're not the general service contractor. So we're going to see that kind of trend carry over. The exhibitor is the primary customer, and they're going to be the best source of revenue, the best source of driving revenue to that general service contractor. That master-slave relationship, if it still exists anywhere, and I hope it doesn't, is going to be a partnership. That's the only way it can work, and there's going to be cost sharing instead of cost shifting. The message is probably getting clear here, shows you're going to start paying more money for stuff. The models that we've had in the past just aren't going to serve us well in the future. Their revenue centers are emerging. You watch some of them in terms of some of the additional services they're providing and some of the things they're coming up with, being very creative, that are generating new revenue services and helping those exhibiting companies do a better job. The value of the corporate knowledge just continues to increase the more years they do the show. And then they're still going to run most of the show floors. My office was in McCormick Place for 5 years, and I decided after being there 5 years, looking at a couple of hundred shows a year, that when I said 75% of the shows were run by general service contractors, I was wrong. It's more like 95%. More like 95%. And the reality is because they're the ones that have the greatest exposure out there on that show floor. They know what's going on, and that they can deal effectively, and they've learned to deal effectively with your exhibiting companies in a much more efficient way than simply telling someone to go get in line at the service desk and order it themselves. So that's the reality of the importance and the role these folks play in your shows. Last, we always need to remember that exhibitions are the last bastion of face-to-face marketing. The traveling salesman we knew of the last century is a footnote. He's gone. You just aren't seeing people ride across the country to take a customer to lunch. It's just not efficient. Suppliers are in touch with their customers every day, email, telephone, and as a result, they don't feel this vacuum until one day they sit there and say, gee, how long has it been since I've seen that customer? I wonder if we're on solid ground as I think we are with them. And where does that take place? It takes place on the trade show floor. And that's where we're seeing the efficiency today. It's up to us, the general service contractors, the facilities, and you, the organizers, to determine the destiny and the future growth and strength of the exhibition industry. And I believe if you'll keep this in mind, that we have a bright future ahead of us. Thank you very much.